Aloha and welcome to the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center's An Afternoon with the Author. My name is Deidre Teagarden, and on behalf of all of us here at the center, we want to welcome you this afternoon. Today, we're actually broadcasting from our education center where we have our newest exhibit up, some beautiful portraits done by photographer Shane Sato. And these are all 14 of Maui's Nisei veterans. The exhibit opens tomorrow, so we thought we would broadcast from down here to let everybody see the beautiful artwork behind me. We are so excited to have Ms. Kimi Cunningham-Grant with us today as our speaker. But before I introduce her, just a few housekeeping items. Of course, we love to take your questions and get them answered for you. So you can type them in as they come to you on that little question and answer box at the bottom left of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can. Of course, we do have a few copies left of Silver Like Dust, signed by Ms. Grant. So if you are interested in purchasing one, you can email me here at the center and we will get that out to you. And of course, if you are new to the center, please visit us at nvmc.org and check out our YouTube channel, Nisei Veterans Memorial Center YouTube channel, where you will be able to rewatch this talk and other talks that we have done in the past. Without further ado, Kimi Cunningham-Grant is the author of 3 books. Silver Like Dust is a memoir chronicling her Japanese-American grandparents and their internment in Heart Mountain during World War II. Her second book, Fallen Mountains, is a literary mystery set in a small town in Pennsylvania where fracking had just begun. And her third book, These Silent Woods, just came out in paperback. Kimi is a 2-time winner of the Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Memorial Prize in Poetry and a recipient of a Pennsylvania Council on the Arts Fellowship in Creative Nonfiction. Her poems and essays have appeared in Literary Mama, Rattle, Poet Lore, and Whitefish Review. She lives, writes, and teaches in Pennsylvania. Let's give her a warm virtual Maui welcome. Kimi, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, hi, Deirdre. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Well, we came across your book a few years ago in Barnes and Noble. We're just taken in by it, and we're so happy that you could talk to us today. So we want to just start off with a little background history about you. And, Pennsylvania, not a lot of Japanese Americans in Pennsylvania. I can say that for sure because I'm from Pennsylvania. But I wanted to know how prevalent the whole Nisei AJA story was in your own upbringing.
Yeah, I would say that my mother moved to Pennsylvania. We were not near any of her family, and so it really was a very small part of my upbringing. We would visit my grandparents a couple times a year, and we would see aunts and uncles on occasion. But I didn't have a very strong Japanese aspect of growing up, and I read about in the book how my mom just kind of cooked, regular American food that, that you would encounter in most typical families. And so then she decided, I don't know if she had this moment where she was like, oh, my kids don't eat Japanese food, and then decided to try to make us eat it. And it didn't, we hadn't grown up eating it. And so then we weren't super responsive to it, I guess, when she tried to bring it in later in our childhood.
Right.
So
and I know
it wasn't a very big part.
So how did you come upon the story?
Well, I knew from a pretty young age. I think my grandparents moved to Florida when I was, maybe 10 or somewhere around there. And I knew because they would sometimes mention being at Heart Mountain. So I knew that they had been there, but I didn't know very many details about it. I don't know that my grandfather, who passed when I was a teenager, I don't know that he ever talked about it. Um, and my grandmother really didn't talk about it either until I started to ask questions.
So that kind of leads me to the next question. I mean, this book, you do such an amazing job of weaving history into this beautiful story between a grandmother and a granddaughter. And it is more than only, it's more than just a history book. It's this lovely woven tapestry. But, talk about how you were able to get your grandmother to tell the story, because at first it seems, she didn't talk about it, she was reluctant. How are you able to convince her to share?
Well, I think, I have to wonder whether, my grandparents left Heart Mountain, really wanted to start afresh. They moved to the East Coast, never went back to California, and they did not teach their children to speak Japanese. They really, I think that's a little more common, that during that time, people wanted to sort of seem as American as they could possibly be, which that meant, you don't speak a different language, you speak English. And so they didn't talk much about that chapter even to their own children. And so this eventually turns into this sort of generational long-term thing where I think my mom and my aunts and uncles didn't even really know much about that time of their life until they read my book and started getting answers. I don't, it wasn't like they talked about it at the dinner table or anything. It was kind of a part of their past. I think they just decided as a unit to sort of put behind them.
Well, I know you're going to talk about this a little bit later, but just in your preface, as you're trying to kind of engage your grandmother into, telling the story, it definitely took you quite some time. I'm just curious, all in all, like how long did it take you to actually convince her to do this?
Well, I think the book takes place over several years, and I was interviewing her during different trips to Florida and trips to Pennsylvania over several years. I didn't sit down to actually write the book until I was not completely done visiting her, but I had sort of gathered a good amount of information. And then I started, and of course, more questions would come up. But it wasn't just that I wanted to know this story or this part of their life. It was that I realized I didn't really know my grandmother. I mean, that's just, I think, I was growing up. Um, we didn't have cell phones when I was a kid. And so we would, and we didn't have FaceTime and that kind of thing. So it was like I would get a letter in the mail and, or a card for my birthday, and we would go visit them. I think twice a year we would try to see each other. And so I didn't know her. And so part of the story or the process of writing the book was just this realization that, like, I don't know my own grandmother. And so that was part of the joy of writing the book too.
Mm, how nice. And you can tell that. I mean, for those who haven't read the book yet, um, you can really feel that in the book, and I think that in and of itself is so special. Um, how old were you when you wrote this book? This was actually your first book that you
Yeah.
wrote, and we
Yes.
talked about this like last week. It's surprising it was your first book, and you know you were younger. You were how old when you did this?
Well, I think my first trip um, to visit her, I was probably 19 or 20. And then I wrote the book and continued writing. I didn't write the book when I didn't start writing it probably till I was maybe 25 or 26, like actually sitting down and trying to write it. And, I had notebooks with notes and I'd been sort of reading, but I didn't really start to write it till then. And then it sold. So yeah, I was writing it through my 20s.
Um, and okay, so let's kind of move on to the book. But before we do, I know when we talked earlier, you had said about how, your age at that time, and how old was your grandmother when she was interned? I mean, was there a correlation of ages
Yeah.
there?
Yeah. And so in that sense, I like that I tried to, work on this book when I was younger, because there's a part of me that thinks like, what would this book look like if I were to write it now that I have my own children, and how would I have thought about, what would it feel like to have a newborn in that little room, and to raise children and not know what kind of future they might have. So I don't get into that a whole lot in the book, because it just wasn't something I thought about a lot at when I was that age. But so when I was starting to interview my grandmother, I was about the same age. She was, I think, 21 when she was intern and got married right around the same time. Yeah, so early 20s she was, and I was interviewing her when I was that same age.
So let's talk a little bit about her experience when she was interned. I mean, you definitely go into that in detail in the book. Uh, I think like those values that you talk about, like Haji, the shame, and the shikataganai, cannot be helped,
Yes.
features so prominently in the book. And how did those affect her in her, those early 20s, being a young woman and then a mother, getting married and then
Yeah.
being a mother? How they affect her?
I'm not sure. I'm not really sure about the Haji, and whether she was super aware, that she was feeling those things at the time. I mean, some of these things, like, they're given a name, but you don't identify them in yourself as you experience it. Even I didn't realize, and I write about this a little bit in the book, that I was kind of buying into that same narrative of like, oh, we don't want to talk about that ugly part of American history. It's just unpleasant, and I know people kind of wish it never happened. And but also sort of buying into that. And the same thing with having the Japanese exchange students come to our house, and my mom trying to make us eat Japanese food and all of those things. So I was buying into that. I don't know, and I wasn't aware that I was doing that. And I don't know if she was too. She definitely um, bought into this idea that things happen and you can't really stop them. This is the way the tide is rolling, and we have to just accept it. And that's just such an interesting concept to me, because um, on one hand you think, it, well, that's a little fatalistic, I guess. And then on the other hand, it's like, well, in so many ways, it did bolster people through being able to just to live through a really hard time of a lot of loss and confusion and uncertainty, that because they just did resign themselves to, this is how it is, and we have to be, there's a resilience that came with that too, I guess.
Right. Um, were any of the memories that she shared, difficult for her to relive? I feel like at some points in the book, um, when she was talking about having to, go to the showers or use, the facilities, and how there was just no privacy, and her dignity and everybody's dignity was really taken away. I felt like in the book she was expressing how now at that age, as she was talking about it, it really affected her maybe more so than it did while she was there.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it really was very, very difficult and traumatic for her to have to do those things that were asked of her, of going to the bathroom and knowing that people could hear you, and having to be naked in front of other people. And I would say, even when she passed away a year ago at age 100, and she was very lucid right up until the very end. but she was still very private, like no one could, she didn't want to see people if she had her pajamas on. And, she just really, she really still felt that, I think, that same sentiment of like, there are certain parts of your life that you just don't want to let people see. So I think, yeah, even reliving that, when she talked about it with me, that was still just a hard, really hard thing for her.
Were there any aspects of her story or her life that really surprised you or really made an impact on you more so than other things? Was there something that stuck with you while writing or talking to her?
I think one of the things that really struck me is that so many times it's the quiet person who doesn't doesn't really speak up and doesn't really, assert themselves. Sometimes those people are the strongest among us. The people that she really just was such a strong person, and you wouldn't see her. She was small, she was quiet and timid, and you would think, whereas my grandfather was, gregarious and, like you wouldn't go into a room and not notice him. And yet she really was just so full of strength, and I think that's one of the things that really struck me when I was getting to know her and learning her story.
You also have some very special artwork behind you.
Yes. So
It's a
it's,
beautiful piece. Can you talk about
don't
that?
know if you can kind of see it.
Yeah.
Yes, so that is something that my grandmother made in camp. So it's embroidery, and it's as I write about in the book, there were classes where people could learn different skills, and they had a good bit of time on their hands, a lot of days, and so that's something that she made. And about for my birthday this year, my mom had it redone and put into a frame. So it's I'm really excited to have it in my house now.
That's very special. So it's some cherry blossoms you were saying with a little bird.
Yes, it looks like a chickadee. I'm not sure if that's what it is or not, but it's black and gray and
Oh,
white.
it's beautiful.
Yeah, I
Um,
love it.
so tell us how your grandparents then went from California to internment, and then they ended up in New Jersey. Um,
Yes.
Talk a little bit about this.
Yes, so they found the ad. Mr. Seabrook had realized that there was affordable labor, I think, to be found in these camps, and they were then my grandfather really decided like this was an out for them, and they could go and work at Seabrook in New Jersey. And they ended up, having, so my uncle, the oldest child, was born at Heart Mountain, and then my grandparents moved to work at Seabrook Farms in New Jersey. They worked there for many many years, and my uh, they stayed there and raised their family there.
And I think so. Your grandmother also had brothers who were at the same time as they were being interned. Yet they had brothers who were serving in
Yeah.
World War II. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. The one served, and the other was had been working and was let go because of his heritage. I think he was at an Air Force base, or um, you've probably read this book much more recently than I have, but I'm forgetting where he was working. But right after Pearl Harbor was bombed, he was asked to leave.
Right. So as so many were, and just
Mhm.
stripped of their titles and all of that. So all right. So that your family's serving, and then your grandparents were in New Jersey, and then they stayed there, and that's where they made their life, right? Was
Yes. And um my great aunts and uncles moved, they all returned to California. So their family is in California. My
And I
grandmother
also,
was the only one that um, left for the East Coast.
and I think she left, and at the same time it was her mother who was ill at the time, right? So when your
Yeah,
grandmother left, she knew she was leaving her own mother who wasn't doing well
yeah,
health wise, and made that really difficult decision. And if I remember correctly, your great grandmother was, telling them, go make your own life. But what a terribly difficult decision to have to make.
yeah. And I think it's one of those things where the world feels so uncertain, and I'm sure it must have crossed their minds that like this could be an opportunity that's here right now, but next week it might not be here, next month it might not be here, we can't afford to wait. There's just sort of a pressure cooker there that you feel that you have to move on an opportunity, and I wonder if that played into their decision to just say this is our chance, we got to go.
Yeah. So just that theme of how courageous the whole family was,
Yeah,
just uh, would you be willing to do a little reading from your book?
sure. Yes. I'll read from the very beginning. I like to do that in case there are people who haven't read it. So do you think, I think I'll do like maybe a shorter reading. Does that
Yeah,
seem
I think I think that's good.
okay?
Of course, we would love to have you read it all.
Yeah. We'll be here for a long time.
Time.
For so many years, she was a mystery to me, a shadow slipping among bodies, a set of hands, a background fixture, dim and indistinct. Sometimes she read, seated upright on the white couch of her living room, her chin tucked, her lips faintly moving as her eyes swept across the page. But mostly she worked, leaning over steaming pots, her glasses fogged, her dark skin sticky with steam, or yanking weeds from among the hibiscus and azalea in the courtyard, or snapping peas at the kitchen table. When my brother and I visited, she didn't swoop us up in an embrace the minute we arrived and stepped out of the car and onto the hot Florida pavement. She didn't gush over how much I'd grown or hold me out at arm's length, studying my face, searching for changes, the way my grandfather, my Ojichan, did. She didn't play with us the way he did either. My grandfather would purchase masks for our visit and hide and jump out to scare us. Our shrill screams would echo through the house and we'd run away in delight. He gave us piggyback rides and romped around the living room. Obachan, however, kept her distance, glancing up from her book as we raced by. If she called our house in Pennsylvania, whether in October for my mother's birthday or on Christmas afternoons, I would know her by her request to speak to my mother and by her accent, the intonation imposed from another language, the strange rise and fall of the syllables, but I didn't recognize her voice. We were at her house in Florida, standing in the hallway just inside the front door when my mother first told me that my grandparents had spent nearly 3 years in a concentration camp. I was 8 or 9 years old. It was summertime, oppressively hot and humid, and we were there for our annual visit. In the living room, my grandfather was chasing my brother around the couch, and in the kitchen, my grandmother was washing dishes. With furtive glances toward her parents, my mother hissed this information softly, like a confession, or maybe it was more like an apology. I didn't ask any questions upon hearing the news. I think because I was afraid of the way my mother's dark eyes looked at me solemnly, as though perhaps I was afraid of the answer, of the weight that the why behind this revelation might bring to my small shoulders. Whatever my reasons, all I knew at the time was that my Obachan and Ojichan had been imprisoned for being Japanese, and I concluded from this conversation that there was something inherently bad about being Japanese, that there was something to be sorry about. Had my parents chosen to raise their family in Hawaii or California, where there are many people of Asian ancestry, or even in some urban area with general ethnic diversity, I might have been more likely to embrace my Japanese heritage as an adolescent. But they chose a small town in Pennsylvania, my white father's home, nestled in the farmed and mined folds of the state's smooth section. My brother and I were two of a handful of minorities in our entire school district. It was not an ideal place for me to sort out issues of racial identity. I spent much of my young life trying to fit in, to be like everyone else around me, and to seem as un-Japanese as possible. I resisted my grandfather's attempts to teach me his language, squirmed in the dining room chair, and told him I couldn't do it, that the characters were too difficult, that I couldn't spit out the sounds. I resented summer after summer the Japanese exchange students my mother invited to our home and expected me to haul along on outings with friends. I turned up my nose at her puffy white mochi and pretended to gag on her sushi. We don't like this stuff, I told her, dragging my brother into the declaration. We're American. Of course, I was oblivious to the fact that in all my efforts to be un-Japanese, I was joining that same old and very Japanese narrative of haji, or shame, that my mother had been participating in when she'd whispered her secret about my grandparents, the same one that had kept my family silent about those years in a Wyoming prison camp.
Thank you. Um, so powerful. Um, it's such a personal book, and it's such a personal look into your grandmother's life, including her life as a young woman, being courted, as a newlywed, as a mother, and later on as a cancer survivor as well. And then while there were a lot of hardships, she talks at the very end of the book about her purpose. And I wonder if you'd care to comment on that purpose that she shared with you.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about asking her to open up and share her story and sort of relive a lot of memories that she had tried to forget about, was that it also, and it was not my intention to do this, but it asked her to reflect on her life and her family and her children and the choices. She was very proud of her children. They all got to, the girls included. She was not able to pursue, well, she never got to finish college, and she grew up in that generation where Japanese families invested, and it wasn't just Japanese families, I don't think, at that time, but um, you know the girls, the daughters, did not, they were not a priority as far as investing money and time toward education. And so she was very proud that all four of her children went to college and were able to pursue careers that they cared about. And that was just, it was like so many years of sacrifice and loss for herself, but she was able to see her family pursue those dreams that she couldn't do.
How did she react when she read the book?
Well, she had been reading drafts throughout. And I was very happy. I wouldn't have felt at peace about publishing this book without her blessing. I think when I first asked her if I could write the book, I think she agreed and probably thought that it would never really get published, like no one would ever really read it. So but she was happy for me, maybe. I think she didn't really want, it was always awkward. I mean, writing a memoir is awkward, I think, because people read it and they think that they know you. They get a sense that they know all about you, and so that's happened to me, and I think that had happened to her a couple times, where someone would read the book and then they would happened to meet her, like I'm one of my mom's friends or something, and um, she would always, I think, feel a little bit horrified that someone would read this and get the sense like, oh, that they know all these things about me and they assume that they know me, but they don't really know me. So, um, but she was happy for me, and she had read various drafts throughout. Um, and one of the most wonderful things that I think she ever said about me was that she felt like after I had done all these interviews that I was the person who knew her the best. So that was such an honor, for her to hear her say.
That's wonderful. Um, how did, speaking of your mother and the family, how the rest of the family react to the book?
I think they were very eager to read it, and my uncle sometimes will talk about um, genealogy, is involved in a lot of genealogy societies, and he has spoken about my grandmother's experience there. I think I think people, they learned a good bit about it. I was really happy that my mother, who she's one of those people that will just tell you the truth no matter what, which is great and sometimes horrible. So, but she said when she read the book, she said, it really felt like I was talking to her, like it was very much her. And so that felt like a huge compliment coming from my mom to say, that she sensed that my grandmother, that I'd captured who she was in the book.
That's
Because if I
fantastic. And
hadn't, she would have told me too.
mm, we always want honesty, but then when it comes,
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
so now your 9-year-old is reading the book.
Yes, he just finished it, so it's like propped up on his bookshelf.
Did he share any thoughts with you?
Well, he did ask me how to pronounce Shikata Ganai. That was like he said he had a question, and that's what the question was. And then he told me that it is his favorite book that he's ever read, which he's I'm sure he's read more exciting books as a 9-year-old, but he was very sweet about it.
How wonderful. Are you teaching your children or encouraging foreign language of any kind, or Japanese, or getting in touch
Um,
with, you know,
they haven't learned Japanese, but maybe we should all try to start learning that. They're learning Spanish, just because it feels, I guess, useful to learn that. But yeah, I feel like they could, especially the 9-year-old. He really seems to pick up languages quickly, so maybe I should have him start learning. So
you
yeah.
never know. So kind of moving forward, I know you're part of a podcast that is kind of focused on internment. You know, how did you get involved with that? Was that as a result of your book? Was it a result of everything that's happening nationally now with social justice, a combination, or can you talk about your podcast a little bit?
Yeah, I actually I just got to read excerpts of Silver Lake Dust for the podcast. I don't have my own podcast, but I got to read sections of it, which was fun because I've never someone else did the audiobook, and which is fine. I didn't want to do the audiobook, but it was neat to kind of read it and get to be a part of this. So it's by Sharon McMahon, and she does a podcast called Here's Where It Gets Interesting. And she did, I want to say, I forget the exact number of parts that she did, but over the course of several weeks, and it was called Resilience, the incarceration of the Japanese Americans. And So she used my book. Each episode, I read an excerpt that they wove into to each week to sort of connect them together. So, um, such a cool project. And she has some other interesting speakers come on. I think it aired in September and October.
We're definitely going to put that link to her podcast
Yeah.
in the recorded version of this talk in our YouTube channel, so people can go check it out. I wanted to ask you about the title, Silver Like Dust.
Yeah.
So,
Actually, I just wanted to add something because you were
oh, yeah.
asking about the podcast. Someone reached out to me who had been listening to the podcast, and they said, my grandmother was also in a camp. My family never talked about it. So I'm going to read your book and learn about it. And she got the book, and it turns out that her grandmother was at the same camp. And so she got to read it. And it's just really cool that someone happened to be listening to that podcast and make the connection. And their family was also at this, the same place. So anyway, that was a little
No,
sidebar.
I mean, I think that's so interesting. And we've been focusing a lot on the internment story, both on the mainland and here in Hawaii. And we've been doing that for the past year or so. We've had a lot of authors come on and talk about internment, and there are so many connections, and people will be listening and they'll say, oh, my grandfather was also. And I think right now there seems to be such an interest and concern for, like I said, social justice issues and the whole incarceration of 125,000 Japanese Americans. And do you, your book, do you feel like it's having a new set of readers, a resurgence from when it was initially published because of that?
I'm not sure. I was really excited that you were using the book through your center, and that people were picking up through there. And I would think a few people will listen to the podcast and be interested to maybe dig a little deeper, or learn a little more too. I'm not sure how public high schools are teaching it nowadays. I'm not sure. It was really, really glossed over when I was young. So I don't know if that's changed, because I still feel like even when this book came out 10 years ago, people were saying, how did I not know this happened, like, at all? Like, even my mother-in-law was like, before I met you, I just didn't know this happened. Like, how did I not know that? So yeah, I think it's good that people are wanting to know more about it, and to
Yeah.
hear the stories of what happened.
And I think that there are more high schools, especially in Hawaii, that are looking into the whole internment, but the whole World War II, say, story, but still not like refocus on other parts of history. I know we're going to get to the question about the title, but before I do that, I wanted to share a couple questions.
Okay.
The first question's from Patricia, and she's asking, what town in Pennsylvania did your parents move to, if you feel comfortable sharing that?
They moved to Huntingdon.
Great, know that. Okay.
So it was sort of in the center.
Very, yeah, very, very rural, beautiful.
Yes. Yes.
Place.
Very rural. Yeah.
Michael is asking, did your grandmother have key takeaways from her experience at Seabrook? My father, Michael's father, was there as well after being released from Tulu Lake, and I have no information about that phase of his life.
Okay. I'm gonna see if I can pull this up. Key takeaways. So, Michael, I'm not sure. I'm very, very curious to know. Um, there was a museum there. I'm not sure if it's still open. But they had so many photographs of the people who were living there and working there, from, you know, not just right after the war, but for years after the war, and the schools and preschools that the kids went to. I think I would say my grandparents really seemed to have a sense of um, gratitude. I want to say that this really was an opportunity that they embraced as a way to get a new life. I was more, you know, suspicious, I guess, of this because I am looking at it through a very different lens of like, well, you were asked to work for very little, for very long hours, and you lived in a very not very nice living quarters, and you really struggled, but it was better than what you had. So then you're supposed to feel grateful. So I was more suspicious, I think, of um, the motives and the experience, but I think that they really felt like, a sense of this was a we were able to find a good, safe place to raise our family, and at a time when we didn't know if there was really any hope for us, that it was a opportunity for hope. And I will say too, Michael, that my all of my aunts and uncles loved growing up there. I mean, they have really fond memories because Seabrook brought in, it was a super diverse area. They had people from Eastern Europe and just lots of different backgrounds, and all the people were sort of starting afresh, and so they loved, growing up there.
I think there's a part in the book where it talks about you or your mother was able to see the Seabrook Museum or something.
Yes, yes,
And
yeah.
see
So
pictures of your grandfather, I think.
yes, we saw a picture of him, and so they have a huge archive of things. I hope they're still open, but I'm not sure if they are because I was there a long time ago.
Yeah, I
But
should check into it.
yeah,
Okay, another question from Jill. Do you like Japanese food now?
oh, I do. Yes, and Jill, I'm happy to report that so do my kids because we started them on it early, so they do really enjoy sushi. And I had my mom come over one time, and I was like, teach the kids how to make it. So she did, and it wasn't the prettiest sushi, but it tasted fine.
It's all about the taste. All right, so let's go back to the title, Silver Like Dust. Where did that originate?
Okay, so I get asked this so many times, and I wanted the word dust in the title because I felt like that was just a thing that my grandmother always came back to when she was talking about Heart Mountain, that just everything was so dusty. It's super dry, the wind would pick up, and everything was just covered in a film of dust. And I liked the idea that dust could also work metaphorically for the book, like that these things that all of her memories had sort of a metaphorical dust on them. And so I liked the idea of having dust in the title. I had but really the title, there is wording in the Old Testament of the Bible, silver like dust, that does come in a verse, and I don't remember the exact verse. But the real thing is that my agent kind of didn't like my original title, and so she said we should change it, and she liked this, and it ended up sticking. So um, I have never had my title stick for any of my three books. It always gets changed by the agent or the publisher. So I
Really?
think I'm just officially a bad title maker, it seems like.
Well, speaking of which, so your new book it just came out in paperback, right?
Yes.
Or it is coming
Yeah.
out in paperback. And that
It just
one,
came out. Yeah.
okay.
I have it. I'll grab it. Sorry.
Okay, good.
that is the
Perfect. And that's about the fracking, correct?
no, this is
Oh,
about a man and his daughter who are living in isolation in the woods.
so your other two books, they're more mystery, correct? We have them
Yes.
on order. We've ordered them, but they haven't come in the mail yet.
Oh, that's
Um,
fun.
yeah. So tell us, why mystery? Just love it.
My transition to fiction was sort of surprising. I think you were reading my bio, and so around 2010, I had won this creative nonfiction fellowship, and I had sold Silver Lake Dust um, to a publisher, and it really seemed like this was probably the direction my career would go. I'd done my graduate work, had focused on creative nonfiction um, and poetry as well, and I was publishing in both, so it seemed like that was where that's what I would do. And then kind of suddenly, and I don't know, I'm not sure exactly why, I was in kind of a state of transition because I had my first son, and I kind of moved out of a town into the country, and I stopped teaching full time, and all these things happened, and all of a sudden I got an idea for a novel, and I just started to write it. So I thought, oh well, I write like kind of literary nonfiction, so it shouldn't be too hard. But it took me forever to write the first book. It was not smooth, it was not easy. I struggled to figure out how to write a novel. I think it took me 6 years, and at one point I scrapped 40,000 words, which is basically half of a book. But so finally, I picked up an agent for it, and we sold it. And in my next book, I wrote more quickly, and it came out in hardcover in 21, and then it just came out in paperback.
Congratulations. Okay, I'm so glad that Francine is asking this next question. Going back to Silver Like Dust, she wants to know, what was your original title?
The
If you can share.
original title was Light's End in the Sky. But I had written part of Silver Like Dust as my thesis for graduate school, and that's what it was called then. And then when I graduated and I finished writing the book, and then when my agent picked it up, she was like, this title doesn't have a good enough of like a ring. We got to come up with something a little more interesting. So, and then the publisher didn't change it. So my other two books were sold, and the publisher changed them, but the publisher kept it. So.
All right. So what is on the horizon for you? You're obviously very busy, but is there another book?
I'm very deep into writing a new book, and it will be coming out, I think, sometime in 2024, and it
All
will
right.
be a similar genre of fiction, sort of. It's not the book These Silent Woods is categorized as a thriller, but it's really more like literary suspense, or some people call it slow burn. So it's not like a super page turner with it's not solely plot driven. It's more about it's like character driven, and so the new book will also be like that.
Okay. And let's see. Her bio says she lives in PA. Is she still living in the same small town, or is she now in a larger city in
I live in rural Pennsylvania still.
It's beautiful, isn't it? Rural Pennsylvania.
It really is beautiful. I like, we're really lucky that we live in a part of Pennsylvania where we have some farm fields. It's not just farm fields. We also have a lot of woods, and, so it's very picturesque. It's pretty. I mean, maybe not like Hawaii, but pretty in a different way.
Well, maybe when you get the next book, and you want to take a holiday somewhere, you could come to Hawaii and we could have you come over to Maui, and then you could do a book signing for all the books and a little
That would be
lecture
wonderful.
here at the center.
I will dream about that day.
We are gently coming to the end of the hour. I'm going to do some quick closing remarks, and then Kimi, I'm going to come back to you for your closing remarks. But we want to thank everybody for joining us today on this Zoom. It's always wonderful to have all of you with us. We have a lot of fun things coming up in December. Our afternoon with the author in December is going to be local Hawaii author and manga artist John Murakami. That is going to be a hybrid event. So you can check out our website. I think it'll be December 10th, the same time as the Maui Comic-Con. But check out our website at nbmc.org. We're excited to have him come over here, but we'll also Zoom it out to everybody. And Kimi, I'm going to come back to you for some closing remarks. And we can't thank you enough for Zooming in. We know it's 5 hours later in Pennsylvania, so we thank you for joining us today.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to come and chat. Thanks for reading my book. I just never want to lose sight of the fact that it's really such a great privilege that people are read my books, that they buy them and bring them into their home and pour themselves into the book for a while. It's just such a great honor. So thank you, all of you who are here today listening, and thanks for reading, and I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And as we say in Hawaii, ahui ho, we hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Aloha.